Now the great thing about deer hunting, deer habitat management, and deer herd management is that you can make positive, lasting changes quickly with switchgrass, food plots, timber cutting, timber harvest. You can turn around your land very quickly by simply making some quality habitat improvement changes that make a difference in 1 year. And with that being said, there's a lot of properties that are out there, and I visit, most of those properties I visit every year. There's something going on that diminishes the returns that the landowners invested in that property, whether it's time or money, resources that they've spent and worked hard on to create. And that's a really good thing. Now, sometimes it takes a little bit of money if you have to relocate food plots, relocate deer blinds, whatever it might be. But I've found that one of the major problems I see on any whitetail parcel, hunting, habitat, even if your goal is to have a great quality deer management herd, you have to have a daylight parcel. And what I mean by that is that deer are hitting a food source on your land every day. You can have dependable movements during the daylight and not a nocturnal property. And let's face it, this is a very hard pill to swallow, but the more habitat improvements you make on your land that aren't connected, that are random, the more of a nocturnal herd you're going to have, and you're going to experience a diminishing return, and that can take years to realize. And that's a problem. Again, years to realize that the efforts you've been putting on your land are creating a nocturnal herd. And just because you're giving the deer more to eat, more cover, does not mean you're doing a great job. Because if you're creating a nocturnal herd, that means you have zero control over that herd. You have zero control of creating a balanced herd, balanced in population with the habitat, balanced sex ratios, balanced buck age structure. Your ability is all for naught if those deer are only coming on your land during the night. But the great thing is, like I mentioned in the front of this video, you can make your property a daylight property literally in one summertime. This does not take years to correct. I've had questions recently. I talk a lot about trying to nocturnal proof your land and make sure that you don't have nocturnal trail cam photos. And I talk about nocturnal trail cam pick ratios and how you should at least have one daylight or around daylight picture for every nocturnal picture. I talk a lot about all these factors, and I get a lot of questions. My property is a nocturnal property. How can I correct that? Does it take years? And it does not. To me, there's 5 steps that you can do this season, this summer, this spring, and going into early fall to correct your nocturnal deer problem that you have on your property. And therefore, you're way closer to meeting your QDM objectives, your QDM goals. Just because you have great habitat improvements does not mean that you're doing a great job with the deer, the local deer habitat. Number 1, if you don't have on your private land, if you don't have season-long and hunting season-long food plots and food improvements, and do not have that draw on a daily basis every single afternoon, then you're not going to be able to really control whether the deer herd in the area is nocturnal or a daylight movement on your property. You have to have that quality season-long food source. What you do in April, May, June, you hear me say this all the time, but great deer herds are not made in April, May, June, July, August, September, February, March. They're made during the hunting season. I had a recent conversation with someone that said, the deer on my land 10 months, they're core bucks, but then they leave for the entire peak of the hunting season for 2 months. Folks, that's not a core buck. That's not a core buck herd. That's not something that you can actually manage long term or that you really have any effect of. You can't hunt them, you can't hold them, protect them, advance them to the next age class. Then you're not doing a great job when it comes to deer herd management just because you gave them some extra food during the summertime. So you have to have that food during the fall, during the hunting season, and then that establishes the daily movement. So you have to have those defined food sources. It can't be just browse. Browse alone does not define a food source, and your neighbor's ag fields don't define a food source. I'm standing here with open fields behind me, and I want to make a point, and we'll circle back to this after point 5. But this field behind me, you can see 2 ridges behind me. It's a nice little bench system, a little bit of a knoll slash point out there in that major ridge system. We can make that a daylight feeding location as it relates to the cover behind it. And I hunted that cover behind it for 12 years, so I know it very well. We can make that right now, cars going by, it's not a daylight feeding, but we can hide that food source. We can define it because it's adjacent to that cover, and we can make that a daylight movement. We'll talk about that at the end. But it all starts again with that daylight defined high quality food source that's diverse enough to last the entire season. Step 2, once you have that daylight defined movement, then you can create layered bedding. Does and doe fawns, family groups, they love to bed as close to that afternoon food source as possible, and they want to stay within that movement every single day, and they don't want to lose that movement. They enjoy that movement. That's what they're there for. And if you give them that cover and food, they'll stay there all year long, which isn't necessarily a good thing. You don't want to create a doe factory during the summer where you have those does and fawns waiting like an army to attack your fall food when it comes up. That's a different topic. Once you have that daylight defined food source, and then you have that opportunity for does and fawns to bed adjacent to that, then you can start to establish those bedding layers where does and fawns are relating to that food source during the daylight every single day, and then that sets up that bedding movement behind that layer for those bucks, and it compacts that movement so you can actually fit an assemblage of bedding on your land that relates to that daylight food source every single day. Now third, you're creating that defined daylight movement then every single day. So you have bucks, doe family groups, afternoon food source. That afternoon food source is on your land, and you're creating that movement every single day. You're allowing that to take place. Most of the lands I go to don't have that. If you have open cover, if you have food, then open cover, a lot of times you're putting deer on your neighbor's land because you don't have that total source of cover where deer can move back and forth every single day and make that movement in cover during the daylight so that they're not exposed. So you have to have the food, does and fawns, the buck bedding, and then that creates that daylight movement. Fourth, once you have that defined daily movement, then you can define how you hunt and how you access your land. So now you can stay off your food plots. And when you can stay off your food plots, you can access your land. You can access your land without being in that defined movement. That means you can chip away at that movement. The stronger that line of movement from buck bedding to doe bedding to food source, water holes in between, mock scrapes, then you can chip away at that movement by coming in from the outside of that movement and putting stand locations appropriately. You can have a stand assemblage. So that fourth point of being able to define how you hunt, because first the deer habitats and the deer habits that they're moving about every single day has been defined so that they can move during the daylight. And it's no different than hunting on public land. There's so many people that are shooting giant bucks on public land every single day of the hunting season, and they're doing so without the food plots, but they're doing so because they've recognized where those deer are at, where they're feeding, where they're bedding, and they're hunting in between, or they're hunting at those food sources or bedding areas without spooking the deer. So number 4, just like you're looking for on public land, just like you're scouting for, and you're making sure that you're finding those movements that can create deer movement and bring deer back and forth throughout their daily daylight movements, you're trying to create on your private land by setting up that definition of food, doe bedding, buck bedding, and defined daily movement. Then you can define how you hunt. You can stay away from your food plots. You have to stay away from your food plots. I'm going to keep harping on that for years to come, even because the food source and the food plots have just as much risk as reward if you're spooking those deer off those plots. And finally, 5th, you have to be able to get in and out of your land spook-free, making zero noise, making very few scent trails coming in and out. Once you're on stand, it's almost impossible downwind of you to fool a mature buck's nose, especially an older doe too. But leaving your scent trail on and off the property, using noisy stand locations, low quality stand setups, using climbers on a small parcel, spooking those deer as you're climbing in and out of those stands. How many deer are spooked? How many hunts are ruined because 200 yards away a mature buck is bedded and he hears you get in and out of your stand, and he certainly won't come near you then. What about when you're going to draw your bow? You're moving around in your stand. We have the Sitka New Fanatic series this year. It's ultra quiet hunting. They feel that they've cut the distance the deer can have, that can hear you in half, using quiet gear, quiet boots, quiet steps when you're walking to your stand, making sure it's stick free, making sure you can move around your stand without the deer knowing that you're there, seeing you or hearing you. You have to make sure that your access is like a predator. You can actually pounce on that deer with your arrow. You can get a shot at them without spooking them. It all starts with the food that defines that daily doe family group use, then where the bucks bed, then where they travel, then how you travel and move about your land, and finally your ability to get on and off the property without spooking deer. They can't hear you, see you, or smell you. You're not leaving a scent signature all around your property. Those are the steps that you need to turn a property around from a nocturnal property to a daylight property. And it can happen this season, before the season, this spring, summer, or early fall. Now again, we could take that area behind me. There's no food source. It's an open area. We could stick a food plot out there. We could rim it in 30 feet of switchgrass. We can make sure that there's cover with switchgrass and bedding and timber and improvements from there all the way back to the cover behind it. And now we can take an area that might even be right behind the camera out in the road. If it relates to daytime cover, if we secure the food source, if we don't walk through it, if we give room for does to bed and fawns next to it, then we can make, and we can turn an area that's 50 yards away from right where we're standing into a daylight feeding hotspot because it's completely hidden. It matches in with those 5 steps. We could then get in and out without spooking the deer as we're going by. And it's amazing the area that's open right now, or an area that's a complete nocturnal property, how you can turn that around in literally just a few months. It doesn't take long. Try it this year. Try making sure that your property is not a nocturnal property. And I can't wait to hear about it this fall because it can be done. I do it all the time with clients around the parcel, make recommendations to do so, and it all goes back to those 5 steps.